how did you get the idea to write Bricktop's Paris about African-American women in Paris between the two world wars?
Well, I think the first thing that I noted in my studies, because I actually started out focusing really on the 18th and 19th century, that was my training. And I kind of moved into the 20th century because of Josephine Baker. So, who of course is a hometown girl, St. Louis, rah rah. And the more I began to read works about Black expatriates, particularly African-American expatriates in Paris, I realized that, wow, there wasn't a lot on Black women expatriates, African-American women expatriates in particular. And so you could find some of the bigger names like Baker or, or Bricktop or whatever, but some of the other women who were quite important during this time and who were going to Paris in the same ways that a lot of the men were, Black men were, like Langston Hughes, Alain Locke, and of course later Richard Wright, James Baldwin. Those are the top, when we think of Black African Americans. And of course, then we have the lost generation. And all of this was occurring during the Jazz age, but it was kind of like, well, it appears that this lost generation lost, their African-American women compatriots. And so
even in the sort of big compendiums of books about Americans in Paris during that period, they're completely absent.
Yes, completely absent. And so it was like, okay, well, I need to make an intervention here because there were a lot of them. I can't get them all in, but I could at least try and create a narrative, a kind of multi-life mini biography of these women of their time in Paris, right? So, so that's essentially what I attempted to do. I started out with like 50 women. And so I decided to kind of winnow it down. And part of that process was also kind of thinking about what we mean by the term expatriate. Right? How do we define expatriation? What do we mean, by what is the difference between immigration, expatriation, exile, et cetera? So I was really trying to tease out what that meant, because there were some women who went there for weeks at a time, but they went and they may have gone on fellowship, some who might have gone for a year, some who might have lived there for 15 years or so. And then of course we have a person like Josephine Baker who eventually becomes a French citizen. So,
right. So you ended up defining it as anyone who spent sort of from a few months to a few years in Paris.
Exactly. That was for me very important because it wasn't so much how long they stayed, it was really about why they came. Right? Why did they come to France? What was it about France? What could France do for an African-American woman in this particular moment in time?
As you also point out in your book, I mean, the African-American women who were coming to Paris didn't necessarily have the resources of an Edith Wharton, who was sort of from the New York aristocracy, or even of a, they by definition they were limited in their resources and how long they could stay.
Yes, many were, and so they could not just kind of take off. Also they were concerned with, propriety. So there were all sorts of things. They didn't want, women traveling by themselves. They were also very much concerned with what was happening back home in the United States, right? They just didn't feel comfortable, giving up the kind of the race question that people were beginning to explore in the United States, as well as you had a flourishing movement, the Harlem Renaissance going on during the Jazz age that was happening all over the, between France and the United States, and that was taking off in places like Berlin and other countries where African Americans had touched down, but they also felt a commitment to the race, and they didn't necessarily feel that they had the leisure time to just go and kind of frolic about. They needed to be concerned with those issues. They also needed to be concerned with racial uplift. They needed to be concerned with establishing libraries, funds, et cetera, et cetera. So they couldn't just jettison, they couldn't just decide, okay, I'm just going to up and leave and do this. But a person like Mary Church, right? But Mary Church Terrell did have those resources, and she was a 19th century figure who would eventually become very prominent in politics and in the Black Women's Club movement. So she went in the 19th century, a very early kind of, she was and she spoke fluent German, fluent French. Her father was a millionaire, Robert Church.
Right. You touched on so many issues just now, kind of running the gamut, but one thing you mentioned, which I was really intrigued with in your book, was the question of propriety and the expectation of how sort of middle-class Black women would behave then. Can you talk about that?
Right. I mean, when we think about a woman, I think Jessie Fawcett, who was, of course, a Harlem Renaissance writer, she had several novels. Plum Bun is one of her most fabulous novels. Spoke fluent French, went to the Sorbonne. she in particular kind of represents that. So in this particular moment, this is also a nadir of race relations in the United States. We've got lynchings, going on. I mean, it's right after the First Great War, in the 1920s, and people are feeling when Black soldiers are returning, they're feeling that Black people are a little bit uppity and demanding their rights. And of course, this is how we get the song, how you gonna keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris, so, this is operational, right? So these people are here and they're demanding their rights. They're like, listen, this doesn't have to be the way it is. And so simultaneously, we're, because the race relations are so fraught, Black women, particularly middle class, upper class Black women, are held to a very high standard with respect to how they conduct themselves, right? So the idea that one has to be suitable if one is Black for citizenship, for respect, for common courtesy. And so these women, like a Jessie Fawcett, well-educated, et cetera, had to conduct themselves in a way that was unimpeachable, right? It's no different from when people selected Rosa Parks, right, to lead the movement, right? She's the one who they decide to sit on the bus, right? And she's presented as this kind of, grandmotherly figure who just had tired feet, when in fact, of course, Rosa Parks was leading the charge around issues of rape in the South. Most people don't know that. She was quite radical in her politics in that way. But she was married. She was very respectful and very respectable. But actually the first person who sat down on the bus, was a young Black girl, but she was 17 years old, but she was pregnant. And so she could not be the face of the movement. So in these 1920s, 30s era, it was the same sort of thing. Black women were subjected to a different kind of scrutiny around propriety, around respectability, around suitability for citizenship. So they became the kind of acid test for whether Blacks should be treated with respect.
So in Paris, they had more freedom. They weren't in this kind of box.
Well, that's precisely what Fawcett said. She says, okay, listen, I can't do this anymore. It's confining to me. It interferes with my writing. So I need a transatlantic rupture from my home country. I love America. I love being a colored woman, as she referred to herself, but I cannot as an artist grow here. So I need a break. I need to go to Paris where I can be more free and I can mingle and not, worry about these sort of issues. But of course, once she gets there, she's unable to write initially because she's, everything, she's just like kind of loosey-goosey, having a great time without these kind of restrictions about, I don't think people really understand like where you can walk on the street, if you could look someone in the eye. Some of these things were deadly, right? These could be murderous with respect to the consequences of actions that we just kind of assume are normal everyday activities.
Right, but we should say also, and I'm going to set the stage with World War I after, that it wasn't just push away from America, it was also the pull of France, because as you say in your book, a lot of these women were artists. They wanted free expression. They wanted contact with French and European artists. So it was also the attraction of France for the same reason that white Americans were going to Paris.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea is that, it's the city of light, it's a cosmopolitan city. It was a meeting ground for all sorts of artists. If you wanted to actually be recognized in the art world in any kind of way, music, whatever, you wanted to be in Paris. And so why wouldn't they want to be in Paris, right? So yes, naturally, they're drawn to that as well, especially if you're an artist. You want to say you've studied under the great masters here and there, or studied at this particular academy. And that's something that the United States couldn't necessarily offer, but also the very fact is they knew that once they had that on their resume, they at least had a modicum of a chance of being taken seriously when they returned home, to say that they were accepted here. But some went just to study French. They were no different than their white American compatriots, except they were also, they knew that they had to work around racism in a different kind of way, and they didn't have to do it in France.
So let's talk about World War I, because that really was the starting point. Was it 200,000 Black American GIs going to fight in World War I in the French theater?
Right, exactly. And so it really is the GIs who lay the groundwork, right? So they go, they're fighting, they're in all these little communes, villages throughout France. And so for a lot of French citizens, and this is the first time that they've been exposed to Black people, right? And so it's shocking to them. All they're getting is war propaganda from the Americans saying that, Black soldiers are savages. They're also getting German war propaganda that, is attempting to lure, Black soldiers to their side by talking about American racism.
Sorry, the Americans are putting out war propaganda against their own soldiers?
Exactly, yes. And so they're trying to discourage intermingling, right? Between, so they've gotten word back that these men are kind of moving in ways that they would not be moving in the United States. So they're attempting to introduce American style racism in the context of France.
Okay, and we should say that the fighting forces were in France were segregated.
Yes, they were segregated. And so what eventually happens is, of course, the GIs are conducting themselves impeccably. They are intermingling with these communities. They are intermarrying. And then, of course, they introduce jazz. So you get James Reese Europe's for his band. It's touring throughout.
He is an American GI who then goes on to play in, okay.
Exactly. He's an American GI who goes on to, who plays in a big band, right? So they're throughout. And so they form a certain cultural function, right? The military always, they have their kind of cultural functions. And so in that context, they introduce jazz, and the French fall in love with jazz. And
this is after the war.
Right. This is after the war. Well, even during the war, they're still, it becomes, they began to, even during the war, right? So, I mean, they're entertaining, so they're not just kind of fighting all the time. So, they're assembling these bands to entertain. And so people in the villages and communes are hearing this music. And in Paris in particular, it takes hold. And, after that, as we say, the rest is history.
But just in terms of French. To delve a little more into the experience of these Black American GIs in France, because I remember reading that some of them were honored as fighters by the French for their service during the war, for their heroism, et cetera, but that the American military officials tried to block that. They didn't want these American Black GIs to be honored in any way. They wanted the French to enforce the American racist rules.
Well, precisely, and the French, of course, were appalled by this because the soldiers, again, had conducted themselves impeccably. They fought the war, they helped free France. And so they felt that they owed these, Black GIs who, were their allies. And so they could not wrap their heads around the idea that the Americans would discriminate in such a way against their own citizens, right? It wasn't that the French were, pure and innocent and not doing things over in the colonies. They were wreaking all sorts of havoc over in the colonies. But, at home in France, they were conducting themselves as a very civilized nation, and they were honoring their own war soldiers from Senegal, the tirailleurs, the Senegalese tirailleurs. So there were these ceremonies going on, and the Americans were simply like, no, we are not going to award them these honorifics. And they're seeing that Black soldiers are being honored by the French. They also were awarding American soldiers, right? So we have Eugene Bullard, who stows away again on a ship, ends up in France, creates a living for himself in France, and ends up fighting for the French. And he, of course,
he's a Black American who stowed away.
American, right? And he, of course, eventually opens the nightclubs and in Montmartre.
So when he arrived, why didn't he fight for the Americans? Why did he fight for the French?
Well, because he could fly a plane. They weren't allowing Americans to be fighter pilots, right? That's another thing. I mean, when we think about a person who I do cover in this, in the work, they were not allowing Black fighter pilots, right? And so, there's a woman, in the work, Bessie Smith, who I talk about, well, not Bessie Smith, but Bessie Coleman, sorry. Bessie Coleman, she's native Chicago. She can fly, she's flying at the same time as Amelia Earhart. Most people do not know who Bessie Coleman is. Now, of course, you go to Chicago's airport, or what is that, ORD? I can't remember the name of it now, but OR, right? You see, the Bessie Coleman, kind of road down. But she was ignored for a very long time, but she could not train in the United States because they were not going to train a Black woman pilot. So she went to France to get her license. Wow. And so the same thing was happening with Black American male GIs. They were not allowed on the fly planes, et cetera. So Bullard flew the plane for the French. So he was a fighter pilot. He was shot down. He was given a medal for his heroism.
Amazing. And I noticed in when you describe the French reaction in your book, that the French take a special pleasure in looking down on Americans in general, but in being horrified by American racism.
Well, yes, of course. I think there is this kind of interesting, for them it's perplexing in some ways that the French were fascinated during this particular era with American technologies, innovative culture, radio, theater, music, et cetera. And they saw Black Americans as a kind of driver of some of this popular culture, right? And mass culture. And so they just couldn't understand, why, again, Americans would treat citizens like this. So this is very important, this notion of citizenship. It's one thing to treat someone who's a colonial, a member of the colonial class this way, but it's a very different, thing when you're treating a citizen this way. And so for the French, they did take a great pleasure in demonstrating that they too were more civilized than the Americans, right? Because for them, the Americans were a little bit barbaric in their treatments. This notion of lynching and for all sorts of petty offenses in the streets, in cities. I mean, they're hearing these stories, and they're appalled by it. Now, let's be clear. They're doing all sorts of things again in the colonies. You can read, if you read Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, he does a nice distillation of all of the things that are happening in the colonies. And that, in fact, many believe that the colonies acted as a stopgap, that they could go there and act out all their colonial fantasies and violence, et cetera, and then come back to the metropole, France, and be civilized. So what was happening in the United States is that we lived cheek by jowl. So American racism was naked, open, and certainly from the French perspective, just absolutely barbaric and uncivilized. And so they embraced African Americans in a way in which it was perplexing to most white Americans, and in many respects treated Black Americans better than they did white Americans.
Yeah. So you have, after World War II, so from the armistice onward, Black Americans coming to Paris, kind of hearing the stories about how they can be free to, be much more free in Paris, that there wasn't the same level of racism in Paris. And there's like the classic story, which I don't know if it's Josephine Baker, arrives in Paris and she can't believe that there are white kind of bellhops helping her with her luggage. And so what was this experience like of coming and seeing the roles reversed?
Well, I think, I don't think for us, we're like, this is just, and you read it, you're like, kind of like, what? Why is she so, but, at this particular moment, this is the world she knew, right? That, no white person would have taken her luggage. No white person would have served her in a hotel, let alone stayed in the same hotel that she stayed in. Although when white Americans would arrive, they would insist that they simply they did not want to stay in these hotels. And generally the French would not comply. And be like, well, you need
white Americans would say they don't want to stay in the same hotels as Black Americans.
Baker, right? She had some incidences like that where the white Americans would insist. Most proprietors would be like, well, you need to find another hotel. Some would, of course, give in to American racism if they needed the money or whatnot. But for the most part, they simply refused to go along with American racism. So yeah, I think there are things that we can be shocked by. But that's not our world necessarily today. This is, segregation in its most unalloyed, horrific sense of the word. This is American style apartheid, right? That African Americans have been experiencing, and to all of a sudden arrive in France. W.E. Du Bois, a grand figure when we think of, Black intellectuals, one of the fathers of sociology in the context of the United States with the Philadelphia Negro. He gets to Paris and he's just consumed by it. He can't believe it. He's overcome because, this again, walking down the street might result in your death, right? If you look the wrong way across someone, if you don't step aside for a white person. So when Baker arrives, she's astounded as a Black woman that she's being accorded the same sorts of respects that white women were given in the United States.
And so word spreads, and there's a kind of, I don't know, I don't want to call it like chain migration, but there's like people coming to perform. And so how large is this community of African American women at its sort of height?
Well, they're very small, right? They're never more than, 100 to 200 African Americans in the city of Paris, and even spread around the countryside. So, that accounts also for the kind of, overwhelming support and whatever, there's not a tipping point here, right? They're not there taking jobs. They're not there, eventually though, the French do introduce quotas about, jazz being played in clubs, right? You had to have a French person in the band. So, and eventually they, essentially move out they want French people playing jazz. And so you have the
is that racial or?
No, it's actually, no, it's just about being French, which I absolutely understand. So you have the rise of like Django Reinhardt and others, who like study with these great, jazz artists, and they adapt French, as I said, jazz becomes French. So no, it's not a function of race at all. It's a function of, French citizenship should be first. And so once they got a handle on the jazz thing, they kind of moved in that direction. So they're small in community. The women's community in entering and exiting at different points is probably never more than 10 or 15 at the same time, these kind of famous women. And then there's some who kind of stay there permanently and they're a magnet for these other women. But again, it's a very small community and they're concentrated, they're in different areas. Some are in Montparnasse, some are in Montmartre, some, are, in and around the Latin Quarter. And so they're doing different things and they all kind of descend, which I try to talk at Bricktop's Club, which is where I kind of focus things like who for these women, where do these women go? And they all search out Bricktop.
Okay, so tell us who Bricktop is. She's the, she's the eponymous woman from your book. Who is she? Where she's from West Virginia, is that right?
She's from West Virginia with multiple middle names. I won't even go into all of them. So because she grew up in a little West Virginia town and everyone wanted her family to name them after. So she's got like 9 middle names.
One of which is Queen Victoria.
Queen Victoria, Ada, Bricktop, yeah. So her name is Ada Smith, right? So, but nonetheless, so she is,
Where did Bricktop come from? Is that
her red hair? So she has red hair. And so she ends up leaving West Virginia, ends up in Chicago with her family. She's a pretty middle-class family. The father's a barber. In that particular time in the 19th century, barbering was, you could provide for your family and whatnot. So the mother would stay at home. Father ends up dying. The family ends up in Chicago's Black Belt. She becomes fascinated by the saloons and she learns how to dance to Charleston and these other dances and sing a bit. She's not that great of a singer, although, Cole Porter does have her sing, Miss Otis Regrets. He composes that song exactly for her. And she does sing it. Does actually her voice is actually quite beautiful. So I think she kind of undersells herself.
Is there a recording of her singing?
Yes, there is a recording at the Schomburg. You could find it at the New York Public Library of her singing Miss Otis Regrets. So she, ends up out in Chicago, then decides to take off to New York. So a lot of these women actually knew each other in Chicago and New York. Mm-hmm. So they got their starts there. She actually also, she dances at Jack Johnson's club in Chicago. And she ends up in New York, is working that circuit because she's a very fair-skinned woman. So because of course in Harlem, when people are visiting Harlem, when whites are coming into Harlem to listen to jazz and going to the Cotton Club and these other places, they're really for high tone Black folks, right? They didn't allow really dark-skinned Black folks, not in the chorus, not, very few, at least the women, the performers, the men jazz performers, they couldn't control that as much, but the women in particular, those women who were dressed up seductively, et cetera, had to look a certain part, Lena Hornish, if you will. Right. And that's how Bricktop looked. And so she eventually gets a telegram from Eugene Bullard, who's like, I want you to come over here and I want you to host this club because she's got a big
come to Paris.
Right, come to Paris. I think it'd be great for you. So she gets on the first.
Who doesn't want to get that telegram? Come on the next.
Yeah, come to Paris. So she ends up in Paris. And ends up at the little club there in Paris, and this is where she first encounters Langston Hughes, who's a busboy, right? He's not the great poet laureate that we know him as. He's a busboy. So he was a sailor, and he decides to get off in Paris and to work in Paris. And so they're working this club together, and eventually she takes off. And so she opens several clubs. She meets Cole Porter, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who she
becomes quite close with Cole Porter.
She becomes quite close with Cole Porter. She basically, he's very, very important to her success in Paris and amongst, the white American set. Now, Bricktop's clubs, when she eventually opens her own clubs, they're places where white Americans and Black Americans will commingle equally. She will not allow any other, but there were royalty that were there, and so
Scott Fitzgerald would hang out there. And
he would hang out there. She would have to kind of see him home because he would get sloshy drunk. So Bricktop is quite well known in these circles. And so, but her circle, again, it's Black Americans, it's white Americans, it's French, it's royalty from all over. She's quite, a saloon. She likes to call herself a saloon keeper.
Okay. So she had this unique kind of social gift of bringing all these people together, including Hemingway, we didn't mention.
Yes, Hemingway. She was not a fan of Hemingway. She thought he was vulgar. So she was not a fan of Hemingway. But this is, of course, again, quite interesting. So, we have Hemingway who's in Paris, and then we have Anna Julia Cooper, a Black American woman who's in Paris at the same time, African American woman who's writing her dissertation on the Haitian Revolution in French at the Sorbonne. right down the street from him. But, we don't have, people are talking about Hemingway, but they're not talking about Anna Julia Cooper. And so we have this interesting kind of erasure. In Bricktop's case, she's kind of hard to be ignored, right? Because even Woody Allen's, the film, that he had Midnight in Paris, they mention Bricktop. Let's go to Bricktops, they say, right? Most people have no idea what they're talking about. They just, let's go to Bricktop. And you see this woman dancing, who we can assume is probably Josephine Baker in the club, dancing. But that's precisely, he has it in there. It's like, let's go. But he had actually featured Bricktop in an earlier film he had done. So she's quite well known. And so when the women are coming over from New York and Chicago,
they have a place to land.
She's a mother figure in Montmartre. She can show them the ropes. She ends up owning a beautiful home out in the countryside. Very few African Americans who could have claimed to have done so. Josephine Baker was among those who could made enough money to do so.
But interesting, when she eventually goes back to New York, Cole Porter ignores her in New York.
Yeah, he can be, he was a bit, he's a bit touch and go. I mean, he was known to be kind of finicky and flaky.
So you don't think it was because it was back on American soil and he didn't want to associate with her?
Well, I don't. I think it really had a lot to do with, certainly the time had changed, right? By the time she comes back, we're post, the Second World War now. And she actually stays for a little while, goes back to France, finds that France isn't even insane, and opens a club later in Rome. And so in that, she doesn't cater then to royalty, et cetera. It's really to the stars, right? She also had a club in Mexico City for a while. So I think I don't know. I don't believe.
And she knew, is it Frida Kahlo that she knew?
Yeah, well, no, that was Josephine.
Sorry, that was Josephine Baker.
Yeah,
there was also a lot of sexual freedom.
There was a great deal of sexual freedom, and there was a lot of rumor about whether Josephine Baker and Bricktop were actually in a relationship, but I have not uncovered any evidence to suggest that. My reading is that Bricktop was extremely maternal to Josephine. She arrives in Paris, she's barely literate. Because of course
Josephine Baker.
Yes, she basically is, working, cleaning homes in St. Louis, and eventually kind of escapes to do, vaudeville, and eventually gets to Paris, with La Revue Negre or the Black Review, and becomes famous in Paris. But when she comes after Bricktop. And by the time Bricktop meets her, she can't really sign her name. And so she's like, okay, why don't you just make a stamp so you can sign your name? And so eventually we get an elegant Josephine who speaks French beautifully and becomes a friend, but she didn't start out there.
You mentioned that when you're researching your book and reading Josephine's own writing in the archives, that you actually see the evolution as she becomes more literate. As she learned how to read and write in both French and English, and how you find this extremely moving.
It is. Considering where she came from. She was a washerwoman's daughter, and did not have access to any sorts of what carried her was her personality, right? Because she wasn't high toned as the language was. She was more browner, and she had a thin voice, and so she wasn't considered attractive in the way in which the Cotton Club girls were considered attractive. So she was, she made her mark making those interesting kinds of faces. And the French, of course, found them endearing, but that's how, and she could dance. She could move her body in interesting ways. But she would not be considered, at least at that time, classically beautiful when compared to, as I say, a Horn figure or, Lena Horne figure or something of that nature. So yes, she really was a rough and tumble kind of make it on your own, hard scrabble. So a lot to be admired in this woman who, at some point, later in the she was the only woman who ended up speaking at the March on Washington. So highly, political, comes back to the United States several times to try and do something around this race question, and is kind of batted down.
Again, feels compelled to go back to the US and be part of the
movement.
Civil rights
She sees a movement going on, but of course she's then, blacklisted. Walter Winchell is very, very, instrumental in her blacklisting. They dry up all her resources. It's pretty awful how she was treated by her country.
Yeah. Just to get back to Paris, on the cover of your book, there's a woman who I had assumed was Josephine Baker, but in fact, is not, it's Adelaide Hall. So, and she was someone who came after Josephine Baker, who Josephine Baker was a little bit jealous of, I think.
Right. Well, Josephine Baker kind of opened up, she blew open these doors, right? I mean, when we think about the African-American dancer, performer at this moment, but, the French were at that particular moment always looking for something new and interesting. And so Adelaide Hall was the next one in line. And she was, again, quite attractive. Baker would, make a point not to be in town when Adelaide Hall was performing. She too eventually opens up a club called the Big Apple in Montmartre. Eventually she leaves Paris though, when the Second World War is on the horizon, and settles in England. But she and Baker become good friends.
Okay.
Yeah, and so this is one reason why, like, despite the fact that they're fighting sometimes, for fame, because Ethel Waters could be horribly nasty to people. But she, again, when she arrives in Paris, she wants to go to Bricktops to make some collard greens. She's tired of croissants. So she wants, so it's a kind of homey place for them. They wanted to be connected still to America. They wanted an African-American community.
Yeah, and food, of course, is always a great way of that.
Yeah.
Simon, I think you have a question.
Tracy, I'm very struck when you talk that I feel that you've built up a personal relationship with some of these people, that you feel that you're in communion with them. Can you talk about how that feels to you?
I absolutely do. Probably and most likely because for me, the Baker story resonates a lot, again, because she's from St. Louis. Because I can see where she grew up. I could see, what it was like for her family living along the banks of the Mississippi River, Laclede's Landing. Also the connection to St. Louis itself, France and St. Louis, it's named after, King Louis. And the fact that the city, flew the tricolor flag, until the Louisiana Purchase. So it's, for me, there's an intense connection. It also has to do with my grandmothers. They talked a lot about, Josephine Baker. She became a kind of example of, French non-racism in comparison to what, racism looked like in the United States. And they were very fair-skinned women who could have passed as white, but, opted not to. And so, yeah, I mean, there's an intense kind of connection, and my own experience studying abroad at a certain point in my junior year, experiencing some of that energy, and a little, of course, exoticism along the way, but understanding it in that context, and still not necessarily, the freedoms were very different, because, this was the 80s when I was studying abroad. But nonetheless, I felt like I could clearly identify with these women who were looking for something new and something different. And that was, of course, part of my family's legacy in making that attraction to France. I didn't start out in French classes. I started out in Spanish. The next day they moved me into the French classes, and my grandmothers were so happy, my great grandmother and my grandmother, because when I came home with the Spanish book, they were like, ugh. When I came home with the French book, they were like, oh, so it was a very different reaction. And so that was cultivated at a very young age.
It's interesting because a number of African Americans, some of whom we've had on this channel, have talked about hearing about France from, you heard it about at the kitchen table from your grandmother and great grandmother. They talked about France as if it was the sort of promised land where everything was magical, and they hadn't actually even been to France. They never had the opportunity to be there. I hope at some point maybe they were able to go, but we've heard this from, I've read this from like Thomas Chatterton Williams and Andre Leon Talley, like there's this dream that you grow up with, but that I think was planted in the interwar years that you are writing about.
Right, absolutely. I mean, the idea was the French were not racist, you were free, it was beautiful, it was highly cultured. I mean, all the things that we think of now when we think about France, right? There's a quote in the book that, I like to kind of refer to, where they talk about, in the 17th century, no one was thinking about France, and Paris in particular, as this, city of culture and cafes and high fashion and luxury and blah, blah, blah. But by the time we get to, 18th, 19th centuries, this is what we think about. And so you feel very different even when you put on a shirt with the Eiffel Tower versus a shirt with Big Ben on it, right? It's just kind of like, there's just something about France. And so that's what I grew up with. And that's, yeah, the feeling, it's an indescribable feeling. So part of it is you're leaving your country for the first time, you're studying abroad, but it's also something about Frenchness. And that has to do with people like Baker, the successes she had, that people thought, well, no one could replicate those successes they believed in the United States. That wasn't necessarily true, but she was the first international Black woman star, and her launch pad was France.
So you arrived was it your junior year
Yes.
abroad? You arrived in Paris. What was it like for you? Tell us about your experience.
It was definitely quite magical. It was like, when you're an attractive woman in France, there's just nothing you can't do. So, and so it was like, whoa, I'm not gonna lie. It was like, whoa, United States, I've died and gone to heaven. It was absolutely
Maybe give us a little taste of your experience.
I mean, it was fancy clubs, fancy dinners. It was, the museums. It was travel. I mean, it was all of those things that, and now, of course, I was, from a, educated family, but nonetheless, this was a very different look on the world. With the museums and the like I said, the different food. I remember the first time, I'd never really done the salmon and the whatever. So that was really kind of interesting to me and so I could not stop eating it, the salmon with the capers and the whole 9 yards. It was like, it's some things you just kind of took to. And, but I remember when I first arrived, I went from eating, these little, baguette sandwiches that the students do, were eating to, next thing, we're in these great clubs, me and my roommate. It was fabulous. I can't, so I mean, for me, it wasn't just the intellectual experience was definitely great. I mean, my French was impeccable by the end of the time, probably ahead of a lot of my classmates, because we were so, integrated into into Frenchness.
Yeah. Did you feel that you were being exoticized by French men?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I knew that was part of it. I mean, of course, we had read all about Baker. I mean, I knew all about Baker. By this time, I had started to kind of think about what I wanted to write on, and I wanted to write on representations of Black women in French literature. At that particular moment, it wasn't a popular thing to do. Most people would be like, listen, what are you talking about there? There's no, because there's no such thing as race in France. You're not going to find an abundance of literature in which Black women are, protagonist in any way or represented in any way. And that just simply wasn't the case. I found it in art, I found it in literature. And now, of course, it's ubiquitous, people are researching it, but at the time in the 80s, when I was doing this, that was not the case. It was a very new kind of mining of French literature and art in a different kind of way. I mean, I think our historians have begun to already mine it, but certainly not the literary scholars. They were much more on the conservative side when I was coming along for graduate school. And even as an undergrad, the undergrad, definitely they weren't. They were like, what is this you're trying to do? But
it must have been so exciting to feel like you were exploring this whole, you had a boulevard, as the French say.
Exactly. The thing is that for me, it was like, there's just no way. The reaction to Josephine Baker tells me that there's something else there, and there's something that came before her. Right, that there was already there was a precedent that was already set. There were already ideas about Black women and sexuality and whatever.
Tracy, I'm sort of struck by this extremely positive experience and account that you gave of your time when you arrived. Did you not experience or see racism or discrimination in Paris at the time?
It was certainly in the 80s. Again, not a lot of Black Americans there. Certainly there were more Black French and others in student communities, but I wasn't really in that community. I certainly knew about French racism. I did not experience it, I have to say. The one time that I did have an encounter in a bank, I was with a friend waiting to do something with the American Express at the time, but we were still dealing with traveler's checks. And some guy who was, homeless or whatever had begun ranting about whatever. It had something to do with me, and but I mean, I specifically remember these French people turning and just looking, and then one woman just ripped him to shreds, and so it's just and he kind of scampered on, so it was like, whoa, that was different. You know, so that moment was interesting, but it was checked also by this woman and the French people who were scowling at the guy and then telling him, "You're the one who needs to go. You're the one who needs to da da da." And he, like, you know, again, scampers on. So I was like, well, that was a very new experience. I don't know if I would have experienced that in the United States. I would like to think I would have if someone were being meddlesome, but yeah, that was probably my sole experience. And I think some of my colleagues look at me like, really, Tracy, you have this really kind of, you know, these rose tinted glasses, you know, and I was like, that's my personal experience. When I do read historically, I'm very clear about what the French have done, you know, the world over in different places, but I can only speak, but my own experience has been a very positive one as an African-American woman.
We were talking before we came on air about the kind of different American and French ideas around race and racism. Could you just give your take on how you would see those differences?
Right. I mean, I always like to kind of boil it down to, you know, I think in many respects, the French are more frank about racism. They will identify something as racist, and they will say racist. Right? That's racism, that's racist, etc. I think the Americans, we are much more, it's a loaded term. It feels so burdensome to us. It's something we don't want to admit. We want to believe in these ideals, but it doesn't quite work in the United States. And so we will use a term, we will say race. Like this happened, like you and I talked about, this happened because of someone's race. And it's like, no, it's not because of someone's race. It happened because of racism. And so whereas the French, of course, have a difficult time around this acceptance of racial identities or race. So you don't have them talking as much about race, but racism. And in the United States, we talk about, we say race instead of racism. And so I think the term in France is always, you know, racism without races, which is impossible to have, but trying to get them, you know, even as, you know, Black French and others began to kind of grapple with the idea of their differentness and trying to explore why they were being treated differently, is very difficult to do when you don't have, you know, a language around race and racial identity, when the country itself doesn't keep statistics by race.
In France, it's illegal to keep ethnic statistics because of the Vichy experience.
Right,
we have a comment from Diane Nickerson. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She writes, "I'm a Black American woman and I lived in Troyes, France from 2005 for 3 years. Troyes is a provincial town outside Paris in the Champagne region, most of you will know. And she writes, I experienced racism, especially when people thought I was Black African, Black Antillais, as opposed to Black American." What would you?
I absolutely agree with that assessment. One, you're in a provincial town too. I mean, Jessie Fawcett writes about, I mean, she actually in the interwar period is one of the writers who identifies French racism very clearly. She travels, and in her novel, she kind of depicts it. This, you know, woman marries a Frenchman and he lives in the south of France, and she kind of talks about certain racist acts that happen. Fawcett herself never experienced them, but she does. She sees it. She understands it. I think that experience is absolutely correct. I, of course, had never, at the time, again, when I was traveling in the 80s, there were very few Antillais, very few Black African women in Paris. And so I think that had a great deal to do with why my experience was very different. Again, the same way that African Americans who initially arrived, there were so few of them that they weren't necessarily threatening in the same way. I was certainly not a threat in that particular moment. I think my reception now, I think what I might experience now might be a little bit different. It has not manifested itself as yet. But that I'm very well aware that someone could, I'm very well aware that my Americanness, and I don't necessarily dress in an American way, but I'm very well aware that my Americanness does provide a certain shield, a certain privilege. But I have yet to have a very, very negative experience. I definitely identify with the experience that the person in the chat has noted. Yeah, but it has not just been and I can only speak from my personal experience. Yeah, but my research experience tells me something very differently.
I'll quickly ask one more follow-up from two of our commenters. Olivia Dixon and Sharon Hilborough make a similar point about racism against Arabs. It might also be that in the last 20 years, French racism has turned more against Muslims than against Black people per se. Might that be part of what we're seeing?
It could be possible. I think that French racism has always been there. I think, I think we hear more about it now. People are writing about it more openly. And, there have been contributing world factors to this kind of, this uptick in what we see as blatant forms of racism that have also been, I would say, normalized in political discourse as well by leaders. In the same way that we have in the United States, certain sorts of political discourse that's been normalized as highly racist and offensive against, different religions and different cultures and different, ethnic identities. So yeah, I mean, all of that. I mean, when I read about, Pamela, I know you were interested in men I like to have known. One of the men that I've talked about is Alexandre Dumas. Some people understand that he was, mixed race, Black, whatever, and he identified as a mulatto. He was subjected to horribly racist screeds and such during his career. And so it's not a new thing. So it's not something that one is unfamiliar with. It's just, yeah, I mean, he brushed it off and kept it moving. That was just his personality. But he definitely did write about it in interesting ways.
Do you think there's still an African-American kind of community per se in Paris? I know that there are a number of like walking tours and books like yours about the history, but do you have a sense of whether there's still like a Bricktop equivalent in Paris?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. There is an African-American community there still, but I don't think you get the same sense of the kind of popularity, international kind of reverence that Bricktop represented. And I think also that has to do with it. I don't know if African-Americans need it in the same way that they did then, because the world, I mean, with, technology and such, I mean, we're so much more connected in interesting ways, but there is an African-American community still in Paris, and, and they're there because they do feel that they are treated differently than they are in the United States.
I wanted to just go back to your book because it's very interestingly, for an academic book, half of it is a novel. And not just a novel, but a murder mystery, which is you imagining the character Bricktop Bricktop and Josephine Baker are characters in this murder mystery. Why did you decide to make half of your academic book a murder mystery?
Well, I mean, I just got to the end of the nonfiction and I just couldn't leave them alone. It was kind of like, oh, what else can we do, with these women, with this story, with this particular era. It's an era that, of course, I wish that I could have inhabited. I mean, there's so many interesting people in and out of Paris during this time. And so I thought, okay, well, let's imagine, Bricktop in her club, quite successful. Josephine Baker comes in, breathy, she hasn't seen Bricktop in, quite a while, because once she becomes very popular, she doesn't come around the African-American community as much. And that was one of the reasons why people kind of shunned Josephine at a certain point in time. So she arrives back, she's in trouble. She needs Bricktop's help.
Who shunned her? Who was she shunned by?
I mean, I think other African-Americans, they just kind of felt like, she, essentially got too big for them and didn't come around anymore. And that was part of, when she began to rise, Pepito Abatino, who was very responsible in Josephine Baker's rise. He was her count, who really wasn't really a count, and they never really married, but they acted, they said that they were married. But this was the early Josephine, and the moment he, kind of discovered her and groomed her, he definitely cut her off from the African-American community. But Josephine and Bricktop still managed to be friends later on in life. There's a picture of them when they're older in the book that I wanted to be sure to include so people understood that there was a connection still there. That Josephine still was very much connected and tethered to the African-American community, even if she elected to stay in France. But nonetheless, the novel was simply an outgrowth of my not wanting to be wedded to the archive, right? I didn't want to have to say this actually happened, so I couldn't veer from it. But here I can imagine, well, Jack Johnson, is in Paris. He's come to the club many times. Why not have Jack Johnson as part of this, helping beat up the bad guys? We knew that there was, the mafia, in Paris at the time, Russian mobs, Italian mobs. Let's introduce them because Bricktop would have known them from New York. Let's bring them to Paris because they did come to Paris. Like everybody else, they wanted to experience Paris. So I wanted to bring all these interesting characters together in a fictional way. And I write a little mystery on the side. So it was
I was going to say, in addition to your many academic hats, you also are, you're a fiction writer as well.
Yeah. So it was really kind of like, this would be kind of great to imagine, and so, it's like, I thought about doing a follow-up and I probably eventually will.
Can you just tell us a tiny bit about your side hustle as a fiction writer?
Well, I mean, again, murder mystery. My lead character is an academic who, of course, ends up in France, and she's kind of moving through different spaces, dealing, with, questions of, French xenophobia and racism around religion. So all sorts of, kind of issues, interesting, kind of cultural dynamics. It's attempting to also distill some of the stereotypes about French, people in that context to make them more, I guess, translatable, because I think people say, oh, well, I can't stand the French would be great without the French people. I'm like, that's absolutely not true. I think French people are phenomenally wonderful people. I was like, how could you say this? And so attempting to kind of explain what you might perceive as surliness, is actually, these are the things that actually are operating here.
Tell us just what, if you're going to recommend your favorite mystery novel of yours, which one would you have us read?
The favorite one is actually in that book. That is my absolute favorite. Yeah. Okay. The autobiography of Ada Bricktop Smith. I think that's my favorite one because it's probably the closest I get to a Walter Mosley. And because it's in that era, where Mosley was initially writing the Easy Rollins series, he was 50s. I like the jazz age. And so I like the language of the jazz age. And so I tried to, really deal. So it's a very noir, right? So there's violence, and things of that nature. Whereas my others, they're more cozy, as they say in the mystery. A lot of the violence might take place off, off the page, that it's happened. I mean, there are a few fight scenes in there, a little bit of cursing, but certainly not like in Bricktop, where you really can do the kind of, Maltese Falcon kind of, noir, beat 'em up type of stuff. So gangsters, and it's a whole different world, a wonderful world to write about. So.
Right.